Good afternoon. I'm Mark Hidgley, Provost of the King's College here in New York City, and we're delighted you've joined us this afternoon for the celebration of a new book by Dr. Anthony Bradley titled Why Black Lives Matter, African American Thriving in the 21st Century. Dr. Bradley will share his thoughts about his book, and a little bit later you'll have the opportunity to pose questions through a text number that will be given in the chat. So please be thinking about your questions as you hear Dr. Bradley's thoughts in the coming moments. Dr. Bradley is professor of religious studies and director of the Center for the Study of Human Flourishing here at the King's College. He's also theologian in residence at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, Lincoln Square here in New York City, and serves as a research fellow at the Acton Institute. His writings on religious and cultural issues have been published in a wide variety of journals, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Examiner, Al Jazeera, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Detroit News, Christianity Today, and World Magazine. And Dr. Bradley is also frequently a commentator in the media and has appeared on such venues as C-SPAN, CNN Headline News, NPR, and Fox News, among others. Among his 10 books prior to this 11th book that we celebrate today are his latest two, Ending Overcriminalization and Mass Incarceration, and Faith in Society. And Dr. Bradley studied biology at Clemson University before taking a master's degree in divinity from Covenant Theological Seminary, another Master of Arts in Ethics and Society from Fordham here in New York City, and his PhD at Westminster Theological Seminary. So again, thank you for joining us today, and welcome, Dr. Bradley.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hidgley, for that introduction. I do want to thank the entire King's College community, yourself, President Gibson, for providing a space for academics like myself to do this sort of work. It's been an honor at the King's College to have opportunities and freedom to publish and have an institution support us as faculty in our publications. I also would like to thank some King's alums who were integral in editing this volume. Matt Rosenbaum, Daniel Hay, and Philip Reeves were all part of the team that did some critical editing. Without the three of them, this book would not have been readable, so I greatly am indebted and appreciative of those three King's alums. I'm happy and delighted, honored to work at a college where I can find students because of our core and because of their aptitude. You have capacity to edit books just like this one. So I am all honored and really delighted to be with you. I want to really frame this discussion in terms of what the book is not about to start. So I would say that this book is not about the Black Lives Matter organization, but it is about the centering of the Black church, particularly the centering of the role that the Black church has played in broadening out the Black Lives Matter focus in light of what we've seen in recent years. For those of you who are familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement or the organization in particular, it grew out of a response to a number of African Americans who were killed as a result of the actions of police. These men and women include Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride, Eric Garner, John Crawford, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and others. And as we've seen in recent days, these killings do continue. They're complicated. They're always complex. But that was really the impetus for the movement. And according to the movement's website, initially the Black Lives Matter movement began as a call to action. It says, quote, in response to state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. Our intention from the very beginning, they say, was to connect Black people from all over the world who have a shared desire for justice to act together in their communities. The impetus for the commitment was, and still is, the rampant, deliberate violence inflicted on us, they argue, by the state. End of quote. Now, what's interesting about this movement is that unlike the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, the Black Lives Matter movement was intentional about keeping the black church on the periphery of their advocacy for black flourishing. I believe this to be a profound error because there has not been a single point in American history where the black church has not been centered, if not adjacent to calls for black thriving. But the movement intentionally wants to keep the church on the margins. They intentionally did not want black church leaders to be a part of those initial conversations and framing of what it means for black lives to matter. And in this book, we believe this to be an error. We want to, in terms of thinking about black flourishing. Keeping God on the margins and what God desires for people created in his image will not lead to long-term thriving. In fact, we argue that keeping what God desires for the human person on the margins is actually a predictor of social decline. And the authors in this book would like to add some perspective on why Black Lives Matter. And our central thesis is this: that Black Lives Matter because African Americans are made in the image of God. And black thriving is, therefore, a derivative of God's desire for human flourishing as we address various issues in this iteration, from criminal justice reform to music to the family to education. All those topics are covered in this book. And we want to also make the case that there is more to black life and there's more to black identity than being victims of injustice. And to really press this point, that black life won't thrive, won't really flourish just because injustice ends. There's more to being black than being adjacent to some of those issues. So the issues raised in this book are really a continuation of a conversation by Alvin Toussaint, a long-term Harvard professor, and Bill Cosby. Actually, in 2007, they wrote a book called "Come On, People," on the path from victims to victors. And really, it was a way of sort of expanding the range of how we thought about black flourishing in terms of the family, in terms of education and things like that. And the issues raised in that book, we are simply continuing this conversation with renewed attention to be paid to the very principles and practices that have historically produced black thriving. We believe that we will not make progress until we hear from black religious leaders who hold the church and the work and person of Christ. We reference this in this Easter season in very high esteem. So we are repositioning this discussion on purpose, repositioning the discussion of why Black Lives Matter with an emphasis on the role of the church in black life. There are basically four areas that are woven together throughout the book, some more explicitly than others. And the four areas are this: human dignity, human agency, moral virtue, and empowerment. Dignity, agency, virtue, and empowerment. And our central claim in this book is that Black Lives Matter because of these four categories, and these four categories are the birthplace for catalyzing and sustaining black thriving in the future. And let's begin with human dignity. Black lives matter because they are created by God and belong to God. According to the Westminster Confession of Faith, after God had made all of the creatures, he created man, male and female, with reasonable and immortal souls endued with knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness after his own image, having the law of God written in their hearts and power to fulfill it, and yet under a possibility of transgressing, being left to the liberty of their own will, which was subject unto change. Besides this law written in their hearts, they received the command not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which while they kept, they were happy in their communion with God and had dominion over the creatures. And so there are implications then with what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God, male and female. And why does this matter? This matters because in the context of slavery and Jim Crow, dignity, human dignity, was denied. It was sabotaged. It was undermined by those institutions. And because denials of human dignity is the very birthplace of injustice and oppression. And so by extension, to be black is simply to be a person. For Emmanuel Monnier, he describes a person this way. A person is the living center of creative activity, communication, and commitment who comes to know him or herself across the bridge of their action. Free, creative, and acting persons were to be in unity with other creative and free persons to create a society in which the structures, customs, and institutions are rooted in and revolved around the person as the center. And so human dignity then is central to black thriving, this idea of being made in the image and likeness of God with these sorts of implications. What sets Christians apart is that all of our thinking about justice is grounded in a Christian anthropology, namely the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God. And this entails certain things, that we are free to think and create and produce and cultivate. We're free to make our own choices and decisions without being forced. We enjoy beautiful things. We rest. We were created to be active, not passive. We have deep personal relationships. We were created for physical intimacy. We need community. And we need connection. God has given man dominion over the lower creatures. He's given them right to use the things that God has made in nature for the glory of God and for the benefit of the human person and for family and community. And insofar as people are cut off and disconnected from opportunities to exercise this level of anthropology, you do not have thriving. And so we're thinking about all of the ways in which African Americans are put in position to think and create and produce and to cultivate their creation, to enjoy beauty and to rest, and to be active and not passive, and have deep personal relationships and connection. And these capacities were sabotaged. They were undermined by Jim Crow and before that, the history of American slavery. And so the very first chapter of the book is titled More Than Victims. Why? Because the primary definition of what it means to be black in America is not derived from past experience with white people. It actually transcends that. That is, being black as a victim of white oppression is not primarily how black identity should be defined. Black identity should be defined, we argue, on the basis of being made in the image and likeness of God. So chapter 6 addresses this specifically with what it means to be a black man. It's sort of discussions about masculinity in the community. And so this is why the church is so important, because black identity needs to be shaped by sound catechesis. What matters is not what the media says, what the news says constitutes black life, but what we believe in this volume, what God actually says. The second category is agency. The work of Albert Bandura is particularly helpful because people are made in the image and likeness of God. They need to have an experience and to know that they have agency. That is, to be an agent says Bandura, is to influence intentionally one's functioning in life circumstances. People are self-organizing, proactive, self-regulating, and self-reflecting. The human person is not simply onlookers of others' behaviors, but they contribute to their life circumstances and not just products of them. And we see this in the Christian tradition in terms of inviting God's intention and framing it for the human person with two commissions. I'll talk about a third in just in a moment. But the first is the cultural commission, namely that men and women were created to exercise their royal status by ruling, developing, and simultaneously developing creation. The second is a social commission. That is, that men and women are created as equal partners of God's intention to use them for good, each with equally important but different roles at times. This provides the basis for marriage and family and community and nations and the entire world community of humanity. So Black lives mattering and thriving can only happen when there is true agency. Albert Bandura describes the four properties of human agency this way. The first is intentionality. People form intentions that include actions and plans and strategies for realizing them. Most human pursuits involve other participating agents, so there is no absolute agency. We are interdependent on one another. Individuals have to accommodate their self-interests if they are to achieve unity of effort within diversity. Collective endeavors require commitment to a shared intention and the coordination of interdependent plans of action to realize them. Effective group performance is guided by collective intentionality. The second property of human agency is forethought, which involves the temporal extension of agency. Forethought includes the future, the capacity for future directed plans, and it's of course more than that. People set for themselves goals and anticipate likely outcomes of prospective actions to guide and motivate their efforts. Bandura also notes that a future cannot be a cause of current behavior because it has no material existence. In this form of anticipatory self-guidance, behavior is governed by visualized goals and anticipated outcomes rather than pulled by an unrealized future state. And so in this sense, we're talking about hope, right? Forethought, beginning to imagine the future. And so you can't have a Black lives mattering, thriving without forethought, without the capacity to have hope in the future. The third aspect of human agency is the capacity for self-reactiveness. Agents are not only planners and forethinkers, they are also self-regulators. Agency thus involves not only the deliberative activity, says Bandura, to make choices and actions and plans, but also the ability to construct appropriate courses of action to motivate and regulate their execution. The multifaceted self-directedness operates through self-regulatory processes in the explanatory gap to link thought and action. So agency, again, has this capacity that one believes that one's activity and work can make a change in the world. And again, that's connected to hope. If you don't believe that you can make a difference in the world, that your life matters, you're less likely to act accordingly, to behave as if your existence makes a difference for the good. The fourth capacity for agency revolves self-reflectiveness. People are not only agents of actions, they are also self-examiners of their own functioning. Albert Bandura continues that through functional self-awareness, human persons reflect on their personal efficacy, the soundness of their thoughts and actions, the meaning of their pursuits, and they make corrective adjustments if necessary. And this is really the capacity to reflect on oneself and to reflect on the implications and impact that one can have in reality. And these capacities for human agency were all denied and undermined. They were sabotaged by slavery and Jim Crow. Human persons are not autonomous agents, nor is our behavior wholly determined by situational influences. Rather, human functioning is a product of reciprocal interplay of interpersonal, behavioral, and environmental determinants, etc. And so the social and political and economic systems that are a product of human action and social systems need help in being organized in order for human flourishing to actually happen. People need opportunities to have their capacities developed. And so in the book, we, again, are going to address the capacity for masculinity. We address the importance of black girls being cared for explicitly, particularly in education. We focus on the need for black women in college to have mentorship and have direction. Why? Because agency is cultivated in community. And so where agency is first cultivated and activated, we argue that it's first cultivated and activated in the context of the human family. So Bruce Fields in the chapter spends a considerable time in the book addressing the importance of the black family and the importance of family in particular, because we can't have black thriving without black families. Here is some a reference from the Christian tradition. Pope John Paul II is going to describe the importance of the family this way. The task of giving education is rooted in the primary vocation of married couples to participate in God's creative activity by begetting in love and for love a new person who has within himself or herself the vocation to growth and development. Parents, by the very fact, take on the task of helping that person effectively to live a fully human life. As the Second Vatican Council recalled, quote, since parents have conferred life on their children, they have a most solemn obligation to educate their offspring. Hence, parents must be acknowledged as the first and foremost educators of their children. Their role as educators is so decisive that scarcely anything can compensate for their failure in it. For it devolves on parents to create a family atmosphere and social development when reverence for God and others, that a well-rounded person and social development will be fostered among the children. Hence, the family is the first school of those social virtues which every society needs. And so in the book, in chapters 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 11, all of those chapters are going to address the importance and the need for strong families and for families to be in part the birthplace for black thriving. And to really press this point, if your attention is on supporting and strengthening the Black Lives Matter, then your attention must also be directed at supporting and strengthening the black family. The black family is a necessary variable in what we believe will constitute a black thriving in the future. I'll just give you a quick example of what happens when the family is broken down. For example, when children grow up in homes without a father in the U.S., this has become a predictor of all sorts of negative externalities. Here are some troubling statistics about fatherlessness in this country. 85% of youth in prison come from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from dad-deprived fatherless homes. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are from dad-deprived fatherless homes. Nearly 25 million children live without their biological father. In this country, 60% of youth suicides are from dad-deprived and fatherless homes. So the family, parents, loving children, imparting wisdom, care, concern, love, etc., all of those things in children, this is also the birthplace of Black thriving. So the book is going to focus on some of the advantages therein. This last category is empowerment. And unless people believe they can produce desired effects by their actions in society in the future, they will have little incentive to act or to preserve or to persevere in the face of difficulties. Whatever other factors serve as guides and motivators, they are rooted in the core belief that one has the power and capacity to affect changes by one's actions. And this also was undermined and sabotaged by slavery and Jim Crow, this sense that my life matters. And so to focus, to be a champion of Black Lives Matter, we argue, is to be a champion of Black empowerment, particularly the empowerment that will have direct connections to political empowerment, economic empowerment, education empowerment, and so on. Efficacy is this belief that whatever individuals have, they can be optimistic, not pessimistic, but optimistic about their capacity to motivate themselves toward good and positive actions. And in the face of difficulties, in the face of adversity, this sense of empowerment, these empowerment beliefs also shape people's outcomes and expectations about the future. If we begin to tell people more and more that your life matters, that your life can make a difference, that you can pursue change, that you can bring effect, it fosters a context for hope. So efficacy beliefs, empowerment beliefs begin to determine how opportunities are viewed and what those impediments that naturally come can be understood in terms of their capacity to activate or demotivate one's interests in making a difference in the future. So this really. This sense of empowerment really does apply to issues like politics and economics. As we think about Black flourishing, there's sort of three questions that really help us frame empowerment and efficacy this way. The first is this: what conditions allow the greatest number of people to exercise their creative and innovative capacities that constitute the vocation of being human? Being human is a unique calling. And so in the book, we focus then on what it means to simply be a human person. And so what conditions allow for that? Secondly, what conditions provide the greatest opportunity for human flourishing in general? And whatever those economic conditions are in the Black context, you will have more Black thriving and flourishing. Thirdly, what economic environments facilitate the human person excelling in moral virtue by exercising free and responsible stewardship? And so we argue that in order for Black lives to flourish, there needs to be networks and opportunities that are going to shape dignity, agency, empowerment, and also virtue, because human persons were created by God for the good. And this issue of human virtue is uniquely and distinctly important, because you can't have proper thriving without properly formed morals. There has to be, and this is by God's design, not only the context for flourishing, but also the internal resources by which one can apply virtuous action to their lives, to their families, to their communities. And so if there is not an emphasis on moral virtue, you also cannot have Black lives thriving. You cannot have Black lives flourishing. And this is one of the weaknesses of the Black Lives Matter movement, or the Black Lives Matter organization.org, is there's not an emphasis on the moral capacity, the moral development within the Black community as well, in ways that are needed to facilitate their own flourishing. So there are the structural issues that need to be addressed, but we argue in this book there's also the moral implications of what it means to be Black and human that affect marriage, that affect sexuality, that affect education, that affect mental health as well. We also address those issues in this volume. And so in conclusion, I do want to invite you all to have an open mind and to sort of think about not just the single variable of Black identity in terms of its being adjacent to injustice, but the capacity for thinking about Black lives thriving across the range of what it means to be truly human. And that's what we hope and desire to have in this conversation, to sort of be at the table as we discuss all of these other issues, to also be discussing the sort of necessary role of Black dignity, Black agency, moral virtue, and also Black empowerment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. What a stimulating set of remarks, and of course makes us all want to go and read your book. And of course, well, I'll take the privilege of, well, first of all, if you forgive me, the number to text if you have a question for Dr. Bradley about his new book is 646-355-8946. 646-355-8946. And it's also in the chat box. And I neglected in the introduction to mention that Dr. Bradley blesses us on a regular basis with his new new podcast, The Anthony Bradley Show. So look it up. There's some episodes already up and you can enjoy those. So I want to take the privilege of asking you a question, because I was born in the 1960s and became a person soon enough to sort of hear some of the social dialogue that was going on into the late 60s and early 70s. And when you were speaking just now, I was struck by your use of this word empowerment, because it's been a word that's been used about various groups in society, and certainly not least about Black lives in American society. And so I wonder, you did a great job, of course, of defining that, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this notion of empowerment in the context you've laid out here, and perhaps the history of that in the last several decades, and what's relevant about that.
And that's great. Thank you very much. We sort of want to recover, sort of recapture, reinsert this category of Black empowerment, because it's an active category. Not being racist is passive, right? And so as we think about some of the contours of Black empowerment, we're thinking about how do we infuse activity in a context of freedom and opportunity, right? And so how do we motivate people and to be sort of free, right? Sort of free economically, free politically, and that means, in the biblical tradition, we talk about encouraging people, putting courage into them, right, to encourage them. And so Black empowerment really sort of emerged out of the 1960s, where part of the intention was to understand that you can do something to make a difference that's positive, right? That you can be an entrepreneur, you can be a politician, right? You can do things other than simply resist injustice, right? That you can be a participant in making communities work, and so we wanted to, in that tradition, give people a sense of owning their dignity, right? We talked about, there was this a song by James Brown, right? I'm Black and I'm proud, right? And so being proud of being Black means that I believe that I have capacity to do something in the world that can make it a better place. And what do we want to do? We want to empower that, right? We want to fan the flames of your dignity matters, that you are made to be creative and free, and we want to sort of ignite that and set that free. And that demands that we put a sense of purpose and meaning to people, especially in communities where there's hopelessness and nihilism, and that undermines flourishing and thriving. If you don't believe your life matters, if you don't believe you have a future, then today you'll often participate in self-sabotaging behavior. So the sense of empowerment was really sort of an antidote to hopelessness. That there's an opportunity to invest in your future because you're worth it, and the future needs you. And so we want to do whatever we can right now to get you set up for a future where you can make a difference.
Right. And then if I may just follow up on that, then you spoke a little bit about the moral dimension that it must accompany this. And you also tied this to the stability of the family and things like this. And so I wonder, again, just thinking about the history of sort of, Black lives in America, what is that something that's been missing, or is it just been underground? Or talk a little bit more, if you would, about what your research has shown in terms of this moral dimension and the family over the last, again, several decades.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's always been central to movements of freedom and liberation, from slavery all the way through Jim Crow, because the church was constantly speaking into, and the church was that sort of organizing institution that sort of brought communities together for the purpose of pursuing justice and freedom. And so we saw this again from slavery all the way through Jim Crow. When Jim Crow ended, people had some options now. They had different opportunities in different communities to attach their framing of freedom and fight against injustice. And so in the 1970s, you began to see sort of the slow divorcing of the centralizing of the Black church to that discussion, to the centralizing of politics, really. And so the political institutions sort of replaced the church as that centering institution. And so there was an emphasis on getting elected, and rightly so. I mean, given all of the prohibitions against political participation, one of the ways in which people began to believe that we could facilitate and advance Black progress was by changing the laws and changing more laws and using the leverage of government to open up opportunity that way. And as that grew, and as that in some cases was effective, in some cases not, there's lots of wonderful debates on that. The role of the church began to sort of slowly take a back seat in those conversations. And so as we talk about injustice and thriving, the need for moral virtue has somewhat dissipated. And I believe that the BlackLivesMatter.org is probably the best representation of that slow divorce that's happened. And so, all of the black churches that I know that are involved in these these issues address both things simultaneously, right? Address the sort of structural issues, but also address the issues in community that might undermine a thriving as well. This was something that was unique about Malcolm X, is that he would both critique sort of racist America, but he would also critique immoral practices where he found them within the black community. We actually need both, and not just in the black community, but in America in general, right? It's markets and government and morality. I mean, that's what makes democracy work. That's what makes our republic work. And if I could just plug the King's College PPE core for just a moment, our core at the King's College bears witness to this, right? Political flourishing, economic flourishing, philosophical thought has to be in conversation with moral virtue. That's the only way that we can make this great experiment in America actually work.
The book is Why Black Lives Matter, African American Thriving in the 21st Century. Dr. Bradley, thank you so much for your book. Thank you for giving us some real insight into today, especially. Good luck with your the Anthony Bradley Show, and we will wrap up today and say good afternoon to everybody, and have a great day and a great weekend.